Morning and welcome to the 29th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking items 3, 4, 5 and 6 in private. 3 is a consideration of the evidence we will have heard on the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Legislative Consent Memorandum. Item 4 is consideration of the appointments process being used to fill a board vacancy on Environmental Standards Scotland. Item 5 is the consideration of a draft report. Item 6 is consideration of our approach to the Stage 1 scrutiny of the Ecocide Scotland Bill. Apologies have been received in private, from Monica Lennon. Are we happy to take the items that I've mentioned in private? We are. So our second item of business is consideration of the legislative consent memorandum on the UK's government sustainable aviation fuel bill. A legislative consent motion is laid when a UK bill makes provision in areas within the competence of the Scottish Parliament or affects the executive competence of the Scottish Government. The committee must report to the Parliament on whether the consent should be granted. We are also taking the opportunity to look more broadly at the prospects of sustainable aviation fuel production in Scotland and its potential role in reducing greenhouse gases from aviation. This will feed into our work later this year when we consider transport aspects of the forthcoming Scottish Government's climate change plan. The bill itself aims to create more stable pricing for a sustainable aviation fuel to encourage domestic production to grow. This is in parallel with increasing the mandate for the use of SAF by the industry. The Scottish Government supports the bill overall, but it's withholding its consent for now on some technical matters, and hopefully we'll be able to see a supplementary LCM shortly. I welcome to the meeting Dr. Sebastian Eastham, Associate Professor in Sustainable Aviation at the Imperial College London, Celeste Hicks, the Policy Manager for Aviation Environment Federation, Professor Graham Hutchins, Regius Professor of Chemistry at Cardiff University, and Professor Mercedes Maroto Vala, Director of UK Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre and Deputy Principal of Heriot-Watt University. Quite a long title, that. And Mark Morrison, who's a senior consultant and Optimat. Thank you all for giving up your time to attend this morning. And we're going to move into questions now. Celeste, I understand that some you will have to go after about an hour, so there are a few questions that may drift later than that, so I'll try and bring them earlier into it. So if it appears we're going out of sync on subject, it's only so that I can get Celeste's opinion before she leaves. So the first question is from me. It's a simple one, I think. There's a variety of ways of producing sustainable aviation fuel. Which, in your view, offers the greatest prospect in Scotland and the UK overall? And does this best method of production then change over time? So are we going to start somewhere and end somewhere else? And which is best for Scotland? Who'd like to start off? Let's start in the room. Mark, do you want to go with that? You're all going to get a chance at this. You won't get a chance at all of the questions.
Okay. I would say, I should say that we, the firm that I work for, Optimat, we did a study for Scottish Enterprise a few years ago looking at SAF supply chains in Scotland. And certainly long-term in Scotland, it's power to fuel. So we've got legislation and ambition to capture carbon, to generate far more renewable electricity than we actually need within Scotland, to produce green hydrogen as a result. And if you've got both captured carbon and hydrogen, then you can make fuels. So we're a bit more limited in terms of other bioresources. So fuel, power to fuel is definitely where I would...
Sorry, say that again?
Power to fuel is where I would put my money. Okay,
so when we were looking at this, we've given the definition of first generation, second generation and third generation. It always helps me to keep it simple. Right. Which of those categories?
That's third generation.
Third generation.
I mean, we already have companies such as Argent Energy in Scotland that are producing biodiesel from waste vegetable oils. So that's the heifer route. So that would be more second generation. We have got potentially the opportunity to make fuels out of forest waste and agricultural waste, but in contrast to other countries such as the US and Norway, our forest waste and agricultural waste is quite dispersed, so that might be an issue.
Mercedes, do you want to?
Yes, I think to add to that, probably I will reflect on the point you made around that temporal variation. I think that's very important to keep in mind here. And I think if we look in terms of on the very short term, actually the opportunity, making it even more focused around Grangemouth is actually around using the terminal and all the infrastructure we have there for blending and distribution. And I think that's something we can get going very quickly. On the medium term, because of resource availability or the lack of it, I think what it will be either the first or the second generation is something you can get quicker because you don't need as much infrastructure. But in terms of the largest opportunity of a market, I agree with Mark, and that will be on what is called the third generation in the paper. But that's something that requires significant infrastructure because all the way from getting hydrogen to getting green carbon, we are going to need to build a lot that we don't have now. So I think in answering your question, we need to put a temporal dependence, and the windows of opportunity vary with time and they increase with a scale, but also with the level of investment that we're going to need.
Okay. Sebastian, I'm not going to ask you if they're right, but do you agree? Hold on. We're not hearing you. No, it's still not hearing you. We're not hearing you, so what I'm going to suggest, I don't know if it's possible, I'm going to leave you in the hands of broadcasting, maybe to sign on or sign off and come back on again. And while you're doing that, we'll go to Graham, I think, next. Yeah, we can. I think we can hear you, Graham. Yep, we're there.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. No, I largely agree. Okay. I mean, my interest in this is I chaired the Royal Society policy briefing on sustainable aviation fuel, which I hope the committee has had sight of. And in there, I think it is access to green hydrogen is crucial for this, whatever way you want to go. And what you require is a drop-in fuel, something which is broadly similar to Jet A, which is the current kerosene fuel. And so power to fuel is an obvious way to go in the short term. We also considered fuels such as hydrogen and ammonia, but these would require changes to the airframe and would not be really viable in the even up to probably 2050. So for commercial, flights. So yeah, I agree.
Okay, Celeste, can we hear you? We can hear you.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree. I mean, I suppose as the NGO voice, we have a little bit of luxury to take a step back and look at it from a sort of more theoretical point of view. And I think the answer actually is partly to do with what you decide you want to do. Because as the other guests have just mentioned, you will need to create the infrastructure. The market won't just decide this. And actually, it's interesting because the SAF mandate and the RCM bill are actually shaping the market. But I think one of the problems we have is that the resources will go where the money is. So if aviation fuel, particularly third generation e-fuels, become extremely expensive, then people won't buy them. So you kind of, the answer's to do with the decisions that you make in terms of what you want the industrial strategy to be. And I'm quite sort of curious to sort of hear about the Scottish perspective on it, because I've been looking a lot at the clusters that are happening in the UK, as in England, in Liverpool and Teesside, and just the way that they're being developed and the questions that are coming out there about who gets access to the pipeline, who gets access to the green hydrogen, is the green hydrogen going to be produced next to the refinery, and these kind of questions about how you plan the cluster is actually that's the stuff that will define what the answer is on the fuel. But from a sustainability point of view, ultimately we will need the e-fuels because they are the best, and we will theoretically have infinite amounts of green hydrogen and electricity if we want to. But yeah, I guess that's a kind of question about just bigger planning.
Okay, and Sebastian, I don't know if you're back.
I hope so.
And I'm very glad to report you are. We can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. I apologise if I've, of course, missed a little bit of some of the previous answers. I'll try and be brief nonetheless. I come at this from the perspective of environmental benefits. So I won't try and speak to practicality. I think others on the call can speak very well to that. But the critical factor to my mind is to transition as rapidly as possible towards SAF, which can be shown to achieve a significant reduction in carbon emissions. And therefore not to overly emphasize early generation SAFs where they might produce only very limited climate benefits. I'd be concerned about locking in too heavily to such SAFs.
Okay, and then just turning to the LCM and the bill that is before the UK Parliament, the LCM before this Parliament. Does it go far enough? In your opinion, the bill, does it drive this forward at the pace that you think it needs to be at? And again, I'll let you each briefly answer on that. Well, let's start at the I don't know where, Graham. Let's start with you, and then we'll go to the others.
You can hear me, okay? Yeah. Unfortunately, I wasn't given this draft to look at beforehand. So I did ask if there were any papers I should be reading, but I wasn't given any. So I'm not going to be able to answer that because I don't know what's in the draft bill. I do apologise.
That's all right. I'm not going to embarrass everyone then. Does anyone have a view on that? Does the bill go far enough? Mark is volunteering.
I'll regret this. I think it's good that it's got part of the bill is dedicated towards the third generation power to liquid. One of the issues which might face Scotland is that, as far as I understand, that the bill is for a certain percentage of SAF within all aviation fuel across the whole of the UK, which, if you're being cynical, could just be to London Heathrow and maybe Gatwick, perhaps Manchester, which is where a lot of companies think that's where the majority of SAF is going to go. So you might not be able to access SAF in other parts. That is the only consideration. I know that when we had discussions with people across the aviation sector, that was a concern that they had, that it might stifle development elsewhere. Okay.
Usually if you're in the room and you don't want to answer the question, you can look away, but you're all looking assiduously at the camera, assiduously at the camera. Does anyone want to come in? Mercedes, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I was trying to reflect on the question before speaking. I think it has the right components. I think as many of these things, then it goes in the execution of a general plan where things work or don't work out. And I think it's going back to what Mark was saying, I think is the details in terms of how it's going to be the distribution. Do we have some market interventions that are described or mentioned rather than described, but how are you going to then implement it? And what warranties you can have here that the implementation is going to be to a benefit for Scotland. And I think that probably not surprisingly, that level of detail is not there, but you need to maybe get reassurance of how the process is going to be carried out and who is going to be in charge of that. So something that will allow some sort of cyclic revision or allocation of number of SAF or permits, I think that would give you an instrument to see how the implementation and the deployment happens.
Kevin, do you want to come in briefly on this?
Very briefly, Convener, because Mark said in his comments previously that there may be a concentration on Gatwick and Heathrow, and yet there is SAF available in airports such as Aberdeen and my own neck of the woods. Do you think that it's a real problem that there may be a concentration in one area? Is Aberdeen somewhat different from other smaller airports? And maybe folk could give us an idea if any airline has made the commercial decision for environmental reasons as a good selling point to move much quicker to SAF than any others. So if we could start with Mark, and maybe others could indicate if they want to come in. I think Celeste. Mark,
Yep.
please.
So, I mean, Aberdeen Airport, my understanding is it's Air BP that are providing a SAF blend to Bristol helicopters that service offshore oil and gas rigs. I know that there is some that goes into Prestwick Airport, and I think Highlands and Islands airports have had some in the past as well. So it's not to say that there won't be SAF available. It's just that at the moment, the demonstration plants that have been developed, so for companies like LanzaTech, Velocis and Fulcrum Bioenergy, are all located in England around the sort of major pipelines that service Manchester, Heathrow. So it's perhaps a concern that, you know, if a airline or a supplier has to comply with certain levels, that they just put it where it's going to be cheapest to manufacture and cheapest to provide that to comply with those levels. That
So in order for it to be cheaper here, we actually need production here in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Okay. Celeste, I think you wanted to come in, please.
Sure. So just I can answer your briefly answer what your question about. Sorry, I'll go back to the first question, which was about the RCM bill and whether it was going far enough to stimulate production. I mean, I sort of have been following it briefly from not sort of in the committee stage, but I've been sort of watching what's been discussed in Parliament when it's been going through. I think that the big question is how high the levy is set at. So the levy needs to be big enough on the fuel suppliers to make sure that there's enough fund in the pot to meet the contracts for difference. So when the strike price goes up, when the price of the fuel goes up, you know, the producers will give the money back to the government. When the fuel price goes down, the contract will top them up. So there needs to be enough money in that pot to make sure it can actually influence the market. But at the same time, they can't do it. They can't set it at a level which will be so high that the airlines will definitely pass the cost on to the consumers, who are obviously the people who buy the air tickets. So I think one of the concerns we have is if you look at sort of the contract for difference, which was used to stimulate the wind industry, you know, it has been incredibly successful at stimulating. It's the same sort of mechanism, and it's stimulated a huge amount of wind production. But, you know, you do still have these residual discussions about, you know, the fact that these long-term contracts, which were locked in 20 years ago, are still causing green levies on people's energy bills now. So I think, you know, everybody needs to be quite cautious that doesn't happen again. So, you know, the fact that we have to produce this basically a subsidy to keep the production coming doesn't end up seeing, from the consumer's point of view, that the bills are going up and that these green levies on their bills are a bad thing. So I think that's kind of really important to consider. And then, sorry, I think that your question was about, does the SAF production need to be close to the airport? Was that what you were saying? And
it was kind of like that. And also, have any airlines made the commercial decision for environmental reasons already to use SAF more?
Yeah, sorry, I just had a lot of things in my head that I wanted to say. So, yes, I mean, broadly, it's much better for the fuel production to be happening where the green hydrogen is, where the pipelines are, and where the access to the undersea storage for any CO2 that you remove from the atmosphere, or you do point source carbon capture. So yes, it does need to sort of be in an industrial cluster. So I think there's lots of opportunities for that in Scotland. And then airlines that have made the commitment, well, IAG, which is one of the big kind of airline groups, which includes BA, and yeah, I can't remember all of them, but yeah, they have, I think they're up to 3% on SAF that they're using in their fleet. And Heathrow actually has made a 3% commitment as well, which is above the SAF mandate, which is 2% commitment. So yeah, some airlines are going big on it, but they tend to be the ones who got deepest pockets and can afford the premium on it.
I wouldn't say 3% is big. Thank you,
I
Convener.
think Graham and Sebastian both want to come in. I think I would also, just for the record, say that when it came to Aberdeen, we did ask Logan Air if they'd like to come, and because I think they have some involvement in the use of SAF, but sadly the diary then seemed to clash. So we might hear from them later. So, Sebastian, do you want to come in first and then Graham? It should automatically try speaking.
Perfect.
We
Thank you.
can hear
Sorry.
you.
Yes, I'll be brief again. I think that the original question was, does the bill go far enough? And I would argue that the bill does need to acknowledge the fundamental limitations of SAF. I noticed that this session began by talking about the need to reduce greenhouse gases, and that this bill was put in the context of overall environmental impact, climate and otherwise. And in that respect, I was struck by the fact that SAF is an important but only partial answer. Air quality impacts from aviation currently estimated to cause on the order of 74,000 early deaths globally every year. And the contrails that form an aviation exhaust, even on an optimistic estimate, they are thought to be reduced by maybe half if you go to 100% uptake of SAF. And contrails are themselves thought to be about 20 to 50% of aviation's overall climate impacts. So with that in mind, I would say that SAF is important, but if we're going to talk about far enough, then we have to be able to recognize that SAF scale-up should be considered alongside other measures that can be deployed at local scales.
Thank you. Graham.
Back in on the point, just to make the point of scale, the amount of SAF that's being manufactured at the moment is can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Is very limited, I would say. The figures of 3%, it's good, okay, because a couple of years ago it was 0.5%. So it is moving in the right direction. But if you wanted to replace all of the UK's requirement at the moment, is 12.3 million tonnes per annum of jet fuel that's used, and then it's increasing annually. That's a huge figure. And so we need a lot more manufacture. And of course, a lot of what is termed SAF at the moment isn't using green hydrogen. It's using, I hate to sort of complicate things with different colours, but it's using what's termed blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen comes from fossil carbon, from methane, natural gas, and the carbon is captured and the hydrogen is used. This is something that's necessary for a transition because people are finding it difficult to get hold of the green carbon aspect at the present time. So it's the scale, yeah. I think if you've got the opportunities to manufacture SAF in Scotland, then this is a superb operation to do and you need to do it close to the airports because you don't want to transport this a long distance.
Okay. So it sounds like to get to what we need, 100%, it might take 100 years. Maybe I've got that wrong. Michael, next questions.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to maybe turn to the potential for the production of SAF in Scotland. And you'll be aware of Project Willow for Grangemouth, in which there were two recommendations or two project potentials identified for SAF production, Project 6 and Project 8. One was HEF and the other one was e-methanol and methanol to jet. I wonder whether you have a view on the proposals set out in Project Willow, whether you think they are realistic and whether you think they are deliverable within the time frames which have been set. And if you're not familiar with the time frame, HEF was by 2032, and Project 8, which was e-methanol and methanol to jet, was by 2035. I was struck by your comments earlier, Mercedes, where you were saying that the infrastructure in Grangemouth would allow us to do things quicker. Those timelines don't feel to me to be very quick. What's your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. So my comment on the infrastructure in Grangemouth, it was particularly around the opportunity that we can jump very quickly on using it as a fuel terminal for blending for SAF. I think that's something we can do quickly. I think going to Project Willow, that is actually then when you start looking at those two opportunities for SAF, I think those timescales probably are even maybe a bit optimistic because the amount of investment that is needed. And let's not forget that right now we do have some infrastructure available that could be repurposed to some extent, but the opportunity to repurpose infrastructure goes very quickly if you don't take care of that infrastructure. So there is a window of opportunity that will allow us to meet those timelines, but I think then we need to make sure that financial commitments happen very soon, and that's not clear that is happening. I think there is one aspect that could make Grangemouth very attractive around Project Willow, and that is when we start looking about the amount of SAF that we need to produce. Right now we produce less than 1% of what we need globally. Now, where do we start to producing a lot more of what we need? The concept, and we have published a paper on that, comes around green flight paths. And how do you identify, the same as we have done in the maritime sector, with the Clydesdale Declaration, looking in terms of free ports, we can do something similar with flight paths. And those flight paths, we have the opportunity of Edinburgh, actually with Grangemouth next door to that, and some of the existing infrastructure that we have, it will allow us to actually make Project Willow very attractive. But that window of opportunity is not going to be for a long time.
Okay. Mark, you've done some work for Scottish Enterprise around this area.
I mean, I think the issue with HEFA is access to feedstock. It's whether Scotland would have enough of that. It certainly could do it at the moment, but there's already a company, Argent Energy, I mentioned, that uses that process to produce biodiesel, and they've got a big plant in Motherwell. When lots of government agencies have done analysis of the feedstocks that they have got access to, and companies have looked to security of those feedstocks, that has been the biggest issue. So for Scotland, I think long term, the thing that if everything plays out as we expect it will in terms of excess renewable energy and then the ability to produce hydrogen, if Project Acorn does come to fruition and we have all the infrastructure in place, because I agree with Mercedes, we just simply don't have the infrastructure, but it is all doable. If that comes to fruition, then we do have a great opportunity for power to fuel. Everything else, there would need to be a lot more analysis as to what that waste is currently used for. So some of the other SAF production is using municipal solid waste, but that requires a huge amount of waste. And the two companies that we spoke about earlier, Velocis and Fulcrum, they're transporting MSW from across the whole of England to their sites in the northwest and northeast of England. Now, whether Scotland has got sufficient MSW to do that, whether it's got sufficient waste oils and fats to do the HEFA route, would need to be looked into in a lot more detail. In terms of timeline for power to fuel, I think, 2035 is probably ambitious.
So one's 2032 and one's 2035. Do you think both of them are ambitious? I think, so the HEF one is 2032 and the e-methanol and methanol to jet is 2035. Do you think both of those timelines are ambitious?
What? Yeah, I mean, I think the HEFA one could be done, but there's the amount of feedstock availability. So I don't know how much Argent Energy are taking out of their suppliers, which are basically just, like I say, waste oils, waste fats, to produce biodiesel in Motherwell. Argent Energy are not considering, or weren't considering, SAF in Scotland a few years ago. They were considering, they're part of a larger American group, Squires. They were considering it in other places, such as the Netherlands and the Far East, where there was a much bigger demand for SAF.
Okay. So, so going back to the point that was made earlier on about the way in which the bill is drafted at the present moment, and if it sets this threshold of what the sector has to achieve, and if that incentivises production to be closer to the major airports, which will make it cheaper for the airlines in purchasing SAF. If there is a danger that the bill as it's drafted at the present moment will concentrate that development of SAF in areas like Manchester, around London, etc., to service Heathrow, Gatwick and Manchester, is there a danger that that will act as a disincentive to investment in some of these projects highlighted in Project Willow, where they've got a very significant capex level of expenditure, if the government take an approach that actually don't encourage a greater use of SAF across all of our airports in the UK? Is that a risk here?
I don't know if you want to.
Got her hand up, although you can't
Sorry.
see it on the screen, so in case you want to bring her in, Michael.
Sis, do you want to come in? Sorry, I couldn't see you the hand up.
I mean, I think I'll go back to what I said before in terms of how realistic any of them are. It's a bit to do with sort of what decisions get made now in terms of the infrastructure. But I think just to sort of add in about the HEFA pathway, currently the SAF mandate says that the HEFA cap will start in 2030 because it is one of the least sustainable fuels, and it doesn't have the same life cycles emissions savings that the other fuels have. So from 2030 on, there's a cap on how much HEFA is allowed to be used, so it drops to 70%, and then by 2040 it's even less. So if something's coming on stream in 2032, it's already going to be in a situation where there's a HEFA cap and the mandate's saying you can't use HEFA. I think it's interesting what you mentioned about biodiesel, because this is one thing we look at as well, is all the used cooking oil in the country at the moment gets used for road transport. So if you did want to use it for SAF, somehow the SAF industry would have to get it all off the biodiesel who producers. How that happens, I don't know. I guess it would have to be a lot more expensive for people to do that. But the other thing to just mention as well is, like, it's not just that the sort of feedstocks are in competition with the different producers of the different feedstocks and industries, but the government policies are slightly in competition with each other as well. So, for example, you mentioned municipal solid waste. There's a waste hierarchy in the UK, which means that all the councils have basically strategies for where their solid waste goes, and a lot of it's being used for energy for waste plants already, which some of them have been given the green light at some of the industrial clusters in England that I mentioned. So again, you're talking about, is there enough feedstock? Well, not if there's another government policy which is directing feedstock to an alternative use. And just, I don't think we're there yet, but there will be a business model or a subsidy, a contract for difference type arrangement for greenhouse gas removals as well. So that will mean that there's another sort of competing government mandate which will draw some of the the greenhouse gas removals to a different pathway. So I think, it's a very, very difficult question, but you have to ask across the whole economy, is the government making sure that these feedstocks are going to the correct place where they have the most environment benefit? I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's partly, where this ends up is partly decisions that you might make now in terms of what infrastructure you want to invest in, but it's also the impact of these policy measures and the sort of financial competition between all the different sectors. So just wanted to sort of give you a flavour of how complex it all is.
That's very helpful, thank you as well. Can I maybe just turn to the issue about, is there a danger that the existing bills that's drafted could actually act as a disincentive to capital investment into SAF production in Grangemouth, given that they are both very significant? One could be £900 million, I presume that's today's prices, and the other project is potentially up to £2.1 billion of capex expenditure, again I presume at today's prices. Mercedes.
Yes. So I think you can look at that as a risk, but I think it's also, I would look at that as an opportunity from the point of view of you need the demand and then you need the supply. So we have Edinburgh Airport, we have Glasgow Airport. I think the opportunity here is whether we can, in time, get Grangemouth to actually start producing SAF at the volumes that are required, and then you have the demand and the supply together. So I think there is an opportunity. I don't see it as a risk, provided that we make that investment on time around Grangemouth to actually start producing SAF. I think there is maybe also one other opportunity here, and going back to the very low level of SAF that we are producing now and how much we need to ramp up. And the other opportunity we need to look in Scotland as well is around the small airports that we have in the islands. That's a very different type of transportation. It's a very different type of airplanes. It's something where the market is much more concentrated, and that could give us actually a head start to get the market going. And that's not something that is available in any of the other industrial clusters in England. So I think we need maybe to think about where the opportunities are to get the market going, and then we can ramp up to the level that is required. We need to start somewhere, and starting Grangemouth is a really big place. We can start on the islands with much more controlled markets as we expand in terms of the production.
Okay. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the planned SAF developments in England are not going to meet the UK's needs for SAF. I mean, even globally, there's not enough planned that's going to meet global needs for SAF. So this is an opportunity to get in at the ahead of the curve, or at least on the curve, where demand is going to go up, and all the airlines, all the people in the aviation sector recognise that, yes, I agree, there's going to be opportunities to shift away from SAF, from aviation fuel later on in this century, but in the medium term, at least to 2050, if not to 2070, we will need SAF. So there's an opportunity to do this. There's also the sites that are being planned. I think they're something like 50 kilotons. And when you put that into the context of what Graham mentioned, we're using 12 million tonnes of aviation fuel a year. Even at full operational capacity, once they've built a full commercial plant, I think it's 500 kilotons. So you need something like 25 of these plants around the whole of the UK. At present, the sites in England just wouldn't be able to cope with that. So we do need something here. We do need something that's also forward-thinking and can adapt to new feedstocks as they become available, as the infrastructure is available. So I agree. I mean, it's not, to my mind, a risk. It's something that we should be doing, and we should be doing sooner rather than later.
Okay, thanks. Can I turn to the issue of the role that low-carbon hydrogen might play in helping to support us in the development of the SAF sector? Graham made specific reference to the issue of green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, the way in which that's been used at the present moment. Can I turn to you, Graham, just to get maybe a bit more detail from you? How important is the low-carbon hydrogen sector going to be to supporting the development of the SAF sector? Oh, hold on. Can't hear you just now.
No, we can't.
Can't hear you.
Can I make a suggestion? I'm sure this is right. Broadcasting will correct me if I'm wrong. They will activate your microphones. If you try and activate them, you will disactivate what the broadcasting are trying to achieve. So I'm sure, Graham, you weren't doing that, but just in case you were, and it gives, right, it gives broadcasting a chance to make sure they've got it right. And you're live.
I'm live, thank you, yes. No, I think it's crucially important to think about this. That, as I keep saying, there's a sort of transition at the moment. If people can use the sort of fossil carbon and get the processes going, then it can be, because there's a plant on Teesside, which is BP Johnson Matthey, and they're taking natural gas, but they're going to be putting the CO2, sequestering it. And so take the hydrogen, which is the blue hydrogen. I think all of these processes need to be used to get the whole infrastructure there, such that when the CO2 becomes a viable source, initially from point sources such as cement manufacture and various things, but eventually from air capture, which we're talking decades into the future. But this difference between blue and green hydrogen, it doesn't matter at the moment. You just want to get the things going with hydrogen and get the processes built. And to come back in on the Grangemouth thing, you've got in Scotland, you've got a superb opportunity there to start getting into the manufacture. And, you know, in terms of a world scale plant that's going to be producing fuels, I think the last costing I saw for a major scale one, which was going to be in America, and I think Sasol were going to build this. I think it was $20 billion, and that was about 10 years ago, and they backed off from it. So the amount of financial capex that's required to do this at the scale for fuels rather than chemicals is huge. And if you've got a price tag of £2.1 billion, it sounds very large, but it isn't in the context of what investment is really needed in this. So I don't know if I've helped you there.
No, that is helpful. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on the importance of the sector. Okay.
Sorry, just don't like interrupting people, but Celeste's time is quite short. I wondered if Michael, we could move to questions from Mark Ruskell on this and let him get his questions in. And Mark, can I just say, could you be mindful that I think Celeste's leaving at 10:25, and I would like a question to her before she goes, so you can't use up all the time between now and then with your questions. Mark.
I won't be. Thanks.
Sorry, Michael, I'll come back.
So I wanted to ask about the broader context here, and particularly around the changes in the UK emissions trading scheme, the withdrawal of the free allocation, and also the international carbon trading scheme, the CORSIA scheme. Do you think those will make a significant impact in terms of emissions reduction? How do you see it working with these particular measures? Celeste, can we start with you, and then we'll take some views around the panel.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. At the moment, the carbon price in the ETS is way below what we need it to be. If you look at the figures that were used in the Jet Zero modelling, so the Jet Zero strategy was designed by the previous government and sort of set out a pathway for how aviation would decarbonise. SAF was actually only one part of it. There are 5 measures, so carbon pricing, removals, greenhouse gas removals, SAF, new technologies and airspace modernisation. So if you look at the chunk of the sort of carbon abatement that was in the Jet Zero strategy, which was due to be delivered from carbon pricing, I don't have the figures on the top of my head, but I think that by 2050 they were estimating the carbon price in the ETS would be something like, I think it was something like £370 per tonne, and it's currently about 40. So it's way below what we need it to be if that's going to be an effective alternative lever to SAF rollout. I mean, the other thing to say is that the ETS doesn't cover most emissions for aviation. It's only intra-EU flights and UK to EU. It's not any international emissions, which are the huge bulk because they're mostly long haul, and obviously long haul are bigger emissions. I think we just did some calculations a few weeks ago based on figures from last year, and we think 12.5% of emissions from flights were covered by ETS price, so 87.5% of flights didn't pay any ETS price. And Corsia, you mentioned, really, we don't have any faith in Corsia. I mean, it's basically an offsetting scheme. It's not even meant to reduce emissions. It's only meant to offset growth in emissions. My boss is actually at ICAO in Montreal at the moment. So, you know, he's following what's happening with the future of ICAO, but it's incredibly slow. And obviously, because it's a UN body, everything needs to be agreed across the board by everybody. So I think there's going to be some interesting stuff to do with how the US and China interact with that scheme in the coming years. So sorry, I don't want to like rain on your parade, but I think we have to be quite cautious about certainly Corsia. The EU ETS could be interesting if the UK does agree to link its ETS with the EU. There's some scope there. The EU may try to include international flights in a review in 2027, so that could be something, but they'll have to stand up to an enormous amount of pressure from countries such as the US over that. So yeah, I think for now ETS is you know, has some potential, but it's nowhere near what we need it to be.
Okay, and in terms of you know, runway expansions, expansions in capacity, is that any way compatible with our climate targets, given ETS, SAF, other attempts to try and curb emissions?
I mean, we don't think so. I mean, I think this is the thing that we really don't understand is that all of the things that I mentioned in the Jet Zero strategy are all fairly nascent technologies. So, you know, you've had questions about is 2% or 3% SAF, is that a good achievement? I mean, it is in the context of where we were SAF production a few years ago. But, you know, if we look at the greenhouse gas removals, like the Carbon Budget 6, was expecting that we would have 5 megatons of greenhouse gas removals operational by 2030. We currently have something like 0.8 megatons, and that's not even in construction yet, it's just in the pipeline. If we look at airspace modernisation, you know, there's some movement on that. The government's just passed a new body called the Airspace Design Service, which is meant to sort of push modernisation on. But, you know, we haven't seen very much on that. And, you know, zero emission flight, which would basically be hydrogen flight or hydrogen electric fuel cell technology flight or battery electric flight. There are some, actually, this is a good thing, you know, this company called Zero Avia has just announced a new factory in Glasgow to be building some of its fuel cell components there for their planes. But they're quite small, but actually they could be useful for companies like Loganair who are doing the Highland and Island drops. But again, you know, if you think about how significant those flights are in the context of global aviation emissions, where, you know, some frequent flyers are flying to New York and back you know, several times a year, it's you know, the development of the zero emission technology is way behind where we need it to be. So yeah, what we really can't understand is why you would take the risk over aviation or airport expansion at this point before you know that these technologies are developing. You know, we certainly feel like if in 5 or 10 years the SAF production's gone up, the removals are happening, and the zero emissions technology is coming along, then, you know, why not? But the problem is none of those things are happening right now. It just feels like a huge risk to increase emissions, because all you're going to have to do is abate those emissions. And if you've got no real credible plan, which we don't think there is at the moment, then you're going to have an even bigger problem down the line.
Would others like to come in on these topics? You have to put your hands up, and the convener will let you in.
You've got Mercedes wanting to come in, Mark.
Thank you. I think it's maybe to add a point here. I agree with what Celeste was saying. I think we may have potentially misaligned incentives, although some of them were never to be an incentive in terms to produce more SAF. So I think we need to keep in mind that the way the EU ETS scheme that we are still using wasn't intended to actually promote SAF production. So I think we need to keep that in mind. But looking in terms of the things that we can control and the market interventions that we can do in Scotland and in the UK, then is when we have to be careful that we don't do market interventions that actually will take fuel production from elsewhere and we import it here. And I think that's the place where we can have more control rather than EU ETS schemes. That even if we align the UK to the EU, it's still going to be something that we don't have a lot of control. So for me, I will turn a little bit the question and say what market interventions we can really have control of to make sure that we promote fuel production in the UK, because some of the things that are being put forward, there is a huge risk that that fuel production will not happen in the UK. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind.
Others want to come in?
Graham and Sebastian wants in.
Right, I can see I'm online. I just wanted to come back to the point that was just made about hydrogen and fuel cells and batteries. I think Scotland's got a real opportunity for the island hopping, but from my opinion, sort of developing battery-powered planes for very short hops would probably be better than a hydrogen-powered plane, because you've got to store hydrogen or the fuel that's going to make the hydrogen on the plane, and it's known that hydrogen as a fuel has got less density than, say, kerosene. But and if you use electricity to generate the hydrogen, you lose 50% of the energy in that process, which no one's mentioned that up until now. So if you've got abundant green energy, if you turn that into hydrogen, you automatically lose at the moment about 50% of that. And that's a problem that is not readily soluble. There's lots of scientists working on that one. So it's best to use electricity where you can, rather than turn it into something else and lose half the power. And island hopping, if you can develop sort of battery-powered planes to do that, they could, I think, be very, very feasible. So I don't view hydrogen personally as an opportunity for air travel. And also the other thing is a hydrogen-powered engine has never been tested at altitude. And so earlier, I think, one of the speakers talked about contrails, and there's no idea what will happen with a hydrogen-powered plane at altitude at the present time.
Sebastian, you wanted him. There's more than a slight lag in the camera. It looks like we've gone to a blank screen. I'm going to suspend the meeting briefly to try and sort this out.
Can you hear me?
Okay, welcome back. That short, unplanned interruption. Sebastian, I think you were ready to go and got cut off in mid-flow.
Thank you, and apologies for broadcasting. I feel like I'm cursed. Two elements, though, just to respond quickly. First, you asked about broader context, and Professor Hutchings just brought in, again, contrails, which I appreciate. It's worth noting that the EU's monitoring, reporting and verification requirement now includes non-CO2 outcomes by 2027, including contrails. So that may diminish, but not eliminate, the relative benefits of SAF by including an element which it doesn't address as completely. The second component was runway expansion. I think this is similar to Celeste's comments in the sense that I would argue that SAF being framed as an enabler of runway expansion gets this the wrong way round. I think runway expansion actually increases the urgency of SAF. And so in that sense, the bill is made more urgent by the apparent fact of imminent expansion.
Okay, Mark, back to you.
That's fine, convener. I'll maybe come back in again later on.
Okay, just because of the shortness of time, the message I'm getting is that we need to go quicker down the route to achieve this, as aeroplane travel is one of the most difficult things to crack as far as reducing emissions. So, simple question. We use more SAF. How much is that going to put on the price of an aeroplane ticket? And will that mean that people are no longer able to afford to fly? And therefore we will achieve it in a different way. So is there a correlation between increasing use of SAF? So if we go up 10% in SAF use to 10% in SAF use, do aeroplane tickets go up by 10%, 20%, 30%? Who'd like to have a go at that? Celeste, because you're not going to get away without answering that. You can start with that.
I mean, that's $1 million question, right? I mean, we think the DfT uses a price elasticity of -1 when it's calculating the impact of ticket price rises on demand. So, you know, you can take that, you know, that's what the DfT uses. I mean, this is what I was trying to say about the revenue certainty mechanism bill, is they've got to get this balance right, because if they put too heavier levy on the fuel producers, which are big oil companies like Shell and BP, and they ask them to pay a lot into the levy, you know, that means that the levy will be more successful because it will be able to stimulate production. But then, you know, I'm fairly sure that the prices that the fuel suppliers are having to pay for that will be passed on to the airlines, and the airlines will argue that they have very tight margins and they will pass it on in ticket costs. So, you know, I think that's what I'm saying. You've got to be a little bit aware of the sort of narrative that happened with the contract for differences on the wind farms, because that's still playing out now. People are talking about the green levies 15 years after they were put on, even though they did deliver what we needed them to. So, yeah, I think it's that. And I mean, what is the sort of impact on demand? It's hard to say. And I think this is something that we really struggled with when the Climate Change Committee gave its CB7 advice in February, because previously they'd said that airport expansion should be a kind of a natural cap on demand, because I'm sure it's not the same in lots of your airports in Scotland, but Heathrow is already at capacity, so there's a natural cap on demand there just because you can't get any more planes in there. So the Climate Change Committee had previously sort of stuck with its line on airport expansion, but this time around they changed it slightly, and they gave a sort of slightly cryptic advice that passenger numbers shouldn't increase any more than 2% by 2035, and they weren't really clear how that was supposed to be achieved, but the implication was it would be through carbon pricing and ticket price increasing, and therefore dampening demand. So we had actually a really kind of complicated discussion at the Environmental Audit Committee in Parliament, where we were sort of being asked, well, is it that you want everyone to stop flying? And we were saying, well, look, demand management doesn't necessarily mean a cap on the number of flights. It's, you know, it can be basically assuming that ticket prices will rise and therefore people won't fly as much. But I'm not sure anybody's really been able to completely model that through and know what happens and, you know, what is the level. And then you get into huge equity issues, because if you make flying so expensive that, you know, your ordinary person can't go on holiday every year because it's too expensive, then there'll be a huge backlash against that. And the rich will just continue to fly because they can afford to fly. So I think, yeah, this is the question, and I'm not really sure anybody knows the answer.
Mercedes, just before I come to you, I just make the observation. I was looking at prices the other day for electricity, for example. If the average electricity bill is £880 odd, £145 of it roughly is used to pay in green levies. It seems a huge amount, and on that basis, we know that the price will be passed on to the end consumer, and so you're going to be pricing certain people out of their trips, and as you rightly say, Celeste, those people that can afford it will fly, and those businesses that can afford it can fly. Everyone else will have to suffer. Have I got that wrong, Mercedes?
Well, I agree with your point on, I think any levies are very likely to be passed very quickly to the passengers. I think I disagree with the point made before that it's only if they go over a certain value that they will actually be passed. I think we need to be cautious on that because history tells us that as soon as you put the levy, it goes very quickly to the end user. We have done a study actually where we publish what will be the increment on a ticket price for a specific flight path. So we study the Dubai-London flight path. All this has to be very specific to the type of flights, passengers, the fuel consumption, so you cannot really generalize. You have to go flight path by flight path. But we did London-Dubai, and we picked that because the type of flights, the type of planes, that they will be more likely to be able to actually take SAF quicker. And what we estimate, and we publish that, it will be a 3 to 12% that will be the increase per ticket for that particular route. You can do something similar and take it to other routes coming from Scotland, but it has to be very route specific. It's very difficult to give a number if you don't go into specific flight paths. There is one additional point we made in that report that we published, is that would be a way to stimulate production of SAF. And going back to issues of equity, I think we need to accept that it's going to be flight paths from more developed parts of the world that will be the first ones jumping into SAF, but we may be using those ones to a way to stimulate production, reduce costs, mature technology, so then subsequently the technology could become cheaper, and then that price that you will pass to the consumer, to the passenger, will become lower as well. And that went actually down to 2 to 6% over time.
Sorry, so just push back a little bit on that. Is it long-haul flights will get away with small increases and short-haul flights will be the ones that bear the brunt of it? Is that what you're suggesting, or have I got that wrong?
No, what I'm suggesting is that the way to actually get the market going and the way to minimize the price to the consumer is maybe along the lines of what you said. This is by going to long-haul flights. Because those give you the opportunity of having a lower increment on the price of the ticket.
Because there's more tickets, is that what you're saying?
Because it's more tickets on the passengers and the amount of fuel that you consume. Yeah. So it's all pulled together that you come up with that.
I wonder where the dividing line is, whether we'll be able to, it'd be cheaper to go to Australia than it will be to Spain. It'd be an interesting concept. Celeste, before you disappear, is there anything you want to add to that? I'm happy then to go to other panellists, but I realise you're pushed for time and I appreciate you staying longer.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to actually jump in on what Mercedes just said. Yes, that we're worried about that as well, partly because of the ETS, because at the moment it's actually, you don't pay your ETS for a flight that's going to, say, Turkey or India, anywhere outside of Europe, basically. So we're worried that actually the way the ETS is set up at the moment, it's incentivising more long haul because you don't have to pay the price to go there. So yeah, I think that is a concern. But yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and please let me know if you need anything else. It sounds like a really interesting inquiry.
Thank you, and thanks for your input. I'm going to stop that line of questioning there. And does anyone else want to come in on pricing? No, shaking their heads. Perfect. Michael, I cut you off in mid-flow, which was very rude. Is there something you want to finish on your line of questioning?
I don't think there's anything else to finish on my line of questioning, but other than just to pick up on the issue of pricing and this 3 to 12%, of course, I presume all of that cost doesn't have to go into the ticket. The airline could try to push some of that cost across its wider cost base, whether it be with maintenance companies, whether it be with service companies, or whether it be with terms and conditions of staff, or whether it be with airport operations, which is how some of the low-cost carriers operate in pushing airlines. So I presume that cost could be dispersed in other ways rather than just being straight onto a ticket. Would that be a fair
Yes, that would be fair. We didn't go into that distribution of that increase of the price as you described now. What we did is we considered what will be the total increase on the cost of the ticket, and that may or may not be passed on to the passenger. But going back to an earlier argument, we had a point made also by Celeste before she left, we need to be careful that doesn't always end up with a passenger. But yes, it could be different ways by which that increment could be distributed.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, Mark, did you finish all your questions in your section, or was there something else you wanted to come on to?
I'm fine, actually. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you. So, and I'm sorry we got slightly out of sync there. Douglas, I think you've got some questions you want to ask.
I've got a few questions I want to ask Convener. I'm going to pick up on that Dubai to London, 3 to 12% again, because that seems a huge range difference, 3 and 12%. Is there a reason why that range is so big? And I was also going to ask, in terms of SAF percentage, on that, would that be what, 1%, 3%? What sort of mixed SAF and sort of normal jet fuel would that be to give the 3 to 12% increase?
So for that study, we actually went all the way to actually start getting 100% SAF into the flights. And we did also the variation that will be from 2030 to 2050. And the price will be going, the increase in the price of the ticket will be going down over time. In terms of the variation between that 3 to 12, you are right. I mean, it's a significant margin in there. It has to do because those routes don't always operate to full capacity. It has to do also with the type of planes as well and efficiency, and that's why we couldn't give a completely just one single-digit figure. We have to give a range of what that will be.
But, sorry, just to pick up again, so that would be 100% SAF. We're looking at 3
yes.
to 12%. Okay. Going back to something I think maybe Mark had raised, you said that there had been no work done on surplus feedstock, where it's all going to come from. Was that right? Or
there has been some work done in that. So some work that goes back maybe 5 years or so, looked at bioresources across Scotland and looked at everything from waste foods to forest and agriculture to basically manure, whether you could use that for different types of feedstock. So that's not for fuels necessarily, it's for chemicals, it's for materials. And on the whole, I mean, we look around Scotland, we think we've got lots of material, but it is all dispersed. So forestry arisings, for example, are generally in remote places, up hills, because all the good timber is taken out, and it's the cost of actually harvesting all of that compared with countries like Scandinavia or in the US or Canada, where they've got much larger forests and they can access much larger volumes. Those are the main concerns, and I think quite a few people have mentioned already the fact that we're already using, I think it was Celeste actually, we're already using food waste oils and fats for biodiesel, for running trucks around and buses, well, not so much buses anymore, around the country. So we don't really have a good supply that is secure enough to produce SAF on a large scale unless we start diverting some of those existing supplies into this.
so are we talking about giving up maybe some agricultural land that we use for food production to change that for SAF production?
Again, this is just my personal view, but if we're taking the path that I think we all hope that we're going to be generating a lot more renewable energy, that we're going to be capturing carbon, we're going to be importing carbon from other countries perhaps, then we've got feedstock there that we can then convert into SAF. And the important thing about this is shouldn't just be seen as producing SAF. These feedstocks can be producing the building blocks for the chemical industry, for other types of materials, so they can be seen as multi-purpose sites where they may be producing SAF one day, or for part of their output, they may be producing some other feedstock that then goes into chemical manufacturing. And they could be switched at various points in their time.
I was going to ask a question about what are other countries doing in terms of SAF production? Obviously, we've mentioned Europe as well, but in terms of China and the US, because from our papers we can see that we are actually importing a huge amount of used cooking oil from China. So I'm just trying to think, does China not require that for their own SAF production, or what's other countries doing in this area? I don't know if anybody wants to come in on this.
Come in on your previous question.
Okay.
So maybe he can do the both at the same time.
I don't know about doing both, but I'll try. Okay. No, I can probably comment. Okay. No, the availability of sort of biomaterial, I just wanted to say, I mean, you said, do we have to give up agricultural land? I think that would be a travesty to do that, to create fuel. In the policy briefing that we did on this, if you wanted to produce all of the SAF using agricultural land in the UK, it would take over 50% of current agricultural land to create those crops. So it's a non-starter, basically, to go down that pathway. And as it's been pointed out, the availability of this is quite diverse, and it's far better suited to chemicals production rather than fuels, because, you know, chemicals are produced on a much smaller scale. You know, you can produce chemicals at the scale of, say, 30 to 50,000 tonnes per annum, and that's a really useful level for products that go into everyday use. And there's a push from the public to use green carbon in shampoos and all these things that they interface with. And at the moment, the companies that make those are being priced out of the green carbon because it's all that carbon, which is the sort of bioavailable material, is going into SAF. And so we were talking earlier about the way in which there's tension in the marketplace. So you've got Unilever that wants to get hold of green carbon, but it finds it's priced out because SAF is taking it. And it really, that carbon shouldn't be going into SAF, it should be going into chemicals. In terms of what are other countries doing, China is getting very well ahead. We had a meeting between the Royal Society in London and the Chinese Academy of Sciences about 18 months ago, and it's clear that they are putting in a lot of production into making methanol by more sustainable routes. And so there is a lot of technology that's going on, and of course, as a centrally planned economy, they don't seem to have the same constraints, and so they move very, very, very quickly. So yes, you should be aware of what's going on in China. America, I think, is totally pushed back on this at the present time, from what I understand.
Okay, thank you. I had one other question. I was just trying to remember what it was now. Yeah, it was about, we took evidence earlier about Grangemouth, and it was actually looking at e-fertilisers, but one of the problems was, in terms of our hydrogen, green hydrogen production, it was seen as too expensive at present. And, you know, if you look at France instead, for example, where they've got a lot of nuclear, they're producing hydrogen at a lot lower cost than we're producing it. So is that going to be a problem for us going forward when we're looking at some e-fuels, that our cost is going to be too high because the hydrogen production at present is too expensive? Anybody want to come in there?
Graham, you leant forward. That's dangerous. It means you're now in camera shot, and you can answer the question if you like.
I'll try. Sorry, I mustn't lean forward in the future. Can you repeat the question so I can answer it?
Just in terms of our green hydrogen production is at present too expensive, which means things like e-fuels is just going to be, it's too expensive. We can't compete with other countries, like France, for example, who are using excess nuclear power to produce hydrogen at a cheaper cost than us.
I don't think that will dissuade us. We need to produce SAF in the UK, and carbon is traded on the high seas. And so, if SAF is available and can be imported, we will import it. I mean, we're importing an enormous amount of our energy at the present time, aren't we? And so, you know, it's a commodity you will purchase if it's available. So I don't think that is going to be a problem. Especially as we're at the moment only producing about 1 or 2% of what we actually need globally. I think we go back to where we were saying earlier. You've got an opportunity to repurpose Grangemouth into getting a cluster of activity for your airports in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And that, I think, should be a focus for what you're trying to do. The UK will probably start to focus on using small modular nuclear reactors, and that's an opportunity to use waste heat to create e-fertilizers and e-fuels. And that is a very live topic at the present time, I would say.
Mm-hmm. But as you said, SAF is a commodity, can be imported. If you're an airline, you may be mandated to use maybe 3% SAF. Well, if you can import it cheaper than using homegrown SAF, so to speak, would you not do that instead?
I think, well, that's the commercial aspect, isn't it? But what we need to do is make sure that we are producing SAF, because just because we can import at the present time, we are facing sort of geopolitical aspects that you may not be able to import it in the future. So I would say there's a strategic importance in producing SAF on the mainland of the United Kingdom. And as we said earlier, it needs to be produced locally to the airports because you don't want to transport it too far. So there's a cast iron strategic case for Scotland to be producing SAF locally to its own airports, I would say.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on the costs?
Mercedes had her hand up first, and then Mark.
Yeah, I think so. There are 2 points to the conversation. One of them going to the price around how expensive is produce hydrogen in the UK. I think what we need to remember is what is very expensive in the UK is the cost of electricity. That's very expensive compared to the rest of Europe. And I think that put us in a very difficult position to decarbonise quite a number of sectors. I was actually last week speaking at the British Institute for Energy Economics, and we have a really good discussion around market incentives and how the price of electricity in the UK is actually dictating or taking away possibilities to decarbonise the industrial sector in general, not just aviation. So I think that's something we need to remember, is really the price of electricity and what market interventions we can do. And in the case of industry, there are plans for 2027, 2028 that actually will bring down that cost of electricity. I think going also related, the discussion was moving around domestic production of SAF. And that brings me back to the earlier point of what market interventions we can do that they will actually stimulate the production in the UK. And I think that's what we need to be very careful in terms of looking at the discussion today, is what those market interventions are that will guarantee that that domestic production happen. Otherwise, we may end up not having a supply chain, and we may have what we have seen in other sectors, that we do a great job decarbonising them, but the supply chain is not in the UK or is not in Scotland.
So is this bill producing the policies that we need to stimulate both demand and supply of SAF, do you feel?
I think that there are the right elements in terms of the market intervention, is then how actually you're going to be engineering those mechanisms and the detail of how you're going to do it, what still leaves you exposed to a risk that the production doesn't happen domestically.
Okay. Thank you.
Mark, don't forget Mark, he was keen to come in.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Mark.
I would just echo what Mercedes has said. It's about security of supply. It's also about thinking of this not in the same way we think of oil and gas production. So SAF need not be produced in the same sort of scale. So we could have modular plants. And I take a case in point. We as part of our study, we spoke to the RAF, and they were keen on the development of modular SAF production plants that they could use in a forward position. Now, those modular plants, they're not built yet. We need to develop the technology to do that effectively. But they could equally be used in some of the remote islands, where you then don't have to provide fuel to the islands. Eventually, it might be power to fuel because the islands have got access to or will have access to lots of renewable energy. So you could have modular plants there. Now, this is something that everybody that we spoke to recognised that there would be far more SAF plants within the whole of the UK than there are refineries. I mean, I think a number of about 50 was quoted. You know, that would be the sort of number as opposed to what we have 6 or 5 or 6 now, something like that. So it's important to think of it in those terms. We're not talking about something that's necessarily the size of Grangemouth or Petronius as it was. It could be smaller modular plants, maybe in the northeast around St Fergus and Aberdeen. Maybe we already have capability in Orkney through EMEC to produce hydrogen. There's a lot of offshore energy, not just wind, there's tidal energy, there's wave energy. So it is going to be expensive in the short term, and we can't get round that. But it's a longer term, and the confidence that globally people will need SAF. Mm-hmm. If we leave it another 5 years, other countries will have stepped into that gap, and then it will be too late. Then it would be looking at it and saying, well, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the capability to do this, so yes, we just continue to import, and then we lose the supply chain.
And so, as you say, it's expensive in the short term. So is this bill a way of getting that money to invest to bridge that gap?
I mean, like I said before, you know, there's elements, it's all got all the right elements. One of the concerns would be this, it's not about fueling individual aircrafts, it's just the overall, each supplier has to commit to a certain percentage of their fuel supply UK-wide to being a certain percentage of SAF. That's maybe a concern, but it's going in the right direction. It's supporting, with having a CFD approach, it's supporting the industry to develop SAF and to make it a commercially viable proposition.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Graham, I know you want in, but I'm going to let Kevin come with his question first, and he might then be able to answer the two together.
Thank you, Convener. I want to pick up on a point that Mercedes made about the electricity pricing regime actually being an impediment to decarbonisation. Can I ask, do you think that the UK government has listened around about electricity pricing and changing that regime in order to ensure that SAF production and other decarbonisation tools can come into play easier? Are they listening, basically, about changing that regime?
So I think from my experience and the work we have been doing in IDRIC, the Industrial Decarbonisation Research Innovation Centre based Heriot Wood, they are listening. We can see it's known that there is now going to be a new scheme to actually reduce the price of electricity for industries. The challenge here, going back to something we have discussed today, is that that particular scheme is not going to enter into effect before 2027. That's a long way for industries that, as we know, on a daily basis, they are making decisions whether they stay here, they shut down, or they go elsewhere. So it's more of the timely and how quickly we may be able to bring that forward, rather than not having it at this point.
So do you think that it would be wise for the UK government to take a holistic view of all of this, including electricity pricing, and as Celeste said earlier, looking at entire areas rather than just one particular sector, to get all of this right in terms of SAF, other decarbonisations, and, of course, as Celeste said, the use of waste? And is that strategy there?
So that's a really good point, because at the end, the way we operate our economy is a system of systems.
Yeah.
So, and it's the complexity of how you unpack that through different government departments and different ways of operating across. So I think that would be the right approach. I think it's very complex because it requires a level of coordination cross-departmental that is not there in some cases.
Thank you. Graham, please.
Yeah, so I wanted to come back. I will answer your question as well, okay? But I want to come back on the electricity costs, because the UK does have high electricity costs. But if we look at the cost that renewables had, if you go back 10 years or more, they were considerably more expensive than the cost of producing power from gas. And that's really come down, and it's come down because of the innovations and the direction of travel. And if we move forward on that, then the cost of that's going to come down. So the same thing is going to happen with green hydrogen. If you start producing this and getting into it, the cost will come down because of the innovations in the sector. So having said earlier I didn't look at the bill because I didn't read the email properly, I've now looked at this and I can see that the direction of travel the bill has should help get the pricing structure down, because if you don't start, you don't make the innovations where the real savings will be made, and that's going to happen. So it's a case of getting more scale of production into this, more SAF being made. And I agree with the point where we're not going to be dealing with massive refinery type structures. This can be dispersed more around Scotland, around the UK, with smaller units that are producing where it needs to be made. So I hope that helps you, but I'm not sure it has.
Anybody else want to come in on electricity pricing regime?
Sorry,
Mercedes,
I think
it's
I agree, Graham, in terms of technology can bring the cost down, but ultimately it's how we are pricing electricity in the UK and the spark gap that we have. And that requires a market intervention because that's the way we price electricity and natural gas. So technology will be able to bring the prices down, but ultimately the spark gap is what we need to actually, through market interventions, to try to close that.
Okay. The regime isn't working. Thank you, Convener.
Well, it's an interesting concept in the fact that we know hydrogen's about 17% more in cost than electricity. And if electricity was forced to subsidise or use hydrogen in the same way that we are doing this, it might bring the cost down and make it easier and cheaper to use hydrogen. It may be a precursor to making hydrogen cheaper, this bill. Bob, the next questions are yours.
It's almost if I'm going to mention hydrogen, Convener. It's almost if you'd done a link for me there. So I know we've spoken about hydrogen. I think Graham in particular was talking about some drawbacks of using liquid hydrogen within flights, and we've spoken a bit more about using that as a power source to produce SAF. But there are opportunities for using liquid hydrogen direct as an aviation fuel, not as a SAF because it's not a drop-in fuel, but does it have the potential to lower emissions and be part of the mix in terms of making aviation carbon neutral? And given that I've taken Graham's name in vain, perhaps we should go to Graham first.
Yeah, I'll give you my personal view on this, okay? Personally, I would not wish to get onto a hydrogen-powered plane. Liquefied hydrogen is an extremely difficult material, and you'd have to have a whole new infrastructure, a whole new airframe. So personally, I don't think hydrogen as a fuel for long distance travel by aviation is viable in the next several decades, because you have to have a healthy regard for cryogenic hydrogen. This is what you would have to have, and the airports would have to be able to store it, because you can't just fly out of the UK on a hydrogen-powered plane. You'd have to have this universally around the globe that certain airports will have this.
Graham, could I come in there?
Yeah.
I hope you don't mind.
Yeah.
And this is all new to me. I read my briefing papers the last few days. This is all new to me. But in reading it, I think the suggestion might be that liquid hydrogen, and I get what you're saying, all the major adaptations we had to be made to like storage and everything else. Could it be used for short haul, so say Aberdeen to Dublin, Glasgow to London, those kind of things? And could there be fleets, if you like, that service that particular market And is that worth pursuing, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, yes, because another point I was going to make is the energy density of hydrogen is much less than kerosene or e-fuels. And so for the same volume of fuel that you would be putting into a plane, you will fly less miles. And so for short haul, it becomes possible, sort of a hybrid hydrogen plane. It would need a whole new airframe. And so timescales would be quite long because you'd have to have it certified for commercial use, and it takes a long time to get an airframe, A, designed, and B, then certified for commercial use. So I think you're looking at sort of 2050 realistically if you want to go down that line. I know some airlines, Airbus, are particularly like this, but I always thought, and it's my personal view, okay, I always thought this was for shareholders to show that they're doing something rather than and I know the plane has been blown with 4 people on it or something. So, you know, it's a long way to go with hydrogen at the present time. But I wouldn't rule it out for short haul, because then if in those different airports you could have that fuel available for refueling the planes, yes. But you could argue, wouldn't it be better to try and get a battery-powered plane to do that short haul?
That's very helpful, Graham, because that's exactly what my next question was going to be, was in relation to battery electric for planes. You hold on to that thought just now, because I want to know if any other witnesses have got any views in relation to liquid hydrogen. All I can go is based on the notes I've got in preparation for today's meeting, which says that by 2027 we're looking at 80-seater planes using liquid hydrogen for short haul, and it's whether as technological advances go further, whether that's worth pursuing. I have no view on it. I think our committee wants to make sure that every aspect of technological advancement to pursue net zero for aviation is being explored, and liquid hydrogen is technically one of those. So we just want to kind of tease that out. Are there any other views in liquid hydrogen? If not, then perhaps comments on the use of battery electric for planes. Sebastian? Hold on, let's thought Sebastian. Mark Morrison's taking the cudgels in the committee.
Well, let Sebastian go first, and then I can.
You're back, Sebastian.
Thank you. I wanted to just jump in on this because you mentioned this question of lower emissions, but also plausibility. I do fully agree with Graham about this being a big infrastructural question. We're talking about sort of a disruptive change in the sector if you were to talk about a large fraction of aviation being liquid hydrogen powered. Consider, though, that is one of the reasons that SAF has sometimes been discussed as a stepping stone to liquid hydrogen, because both do need green hydrogen production at scale. I also would agree very much that the timescales are long. I have somewhat less maybe skepticism about the viability eventually of long-haul hydrogen aircraft, but I think that you are talking about a very long timescale at that point, because you would need entirely new airframe designs, and that would mean new certification routes and so on and so forth. So that is sort of second half of the century, in my opinion, if we're talking about that scale of hydrogen uptake. But you mentioned, as I say, emissions. I wanted to point out that on the one hand, air quality relevant emissions, many would likely not be affected, not really expect any change in nitrogen oxide emissions, for example. The science is unsettled. There are some claims of there being a potential for a large reduction in contrail impacts, far beyond what can be achieved with SAF. But there's also research suggesting that that would not be achieved. So I don't think we'll know the answer to that in the foreseeable future. But it is worth pointing out again that with hydrogen, you don't have as much of a challenge in terms of closing the cycle on carbon. At the end of the day, it's a zero carbon fuel. So I think that there is actually something to be said about hydrogen having a serious emissions benefit, which might go beyond what we can get with carbon-based SAF.
Okay, thank you. And before I move on to Mark Morrison, do you want to say anything about battery electric? I think in my note it said Norway was hoping to move by 2030 for short haul, maybe even some kind of medium haul flights to be almost exclusively new fleets coming through with battery electric. Do you want to say anything about that before we pass to Mark Morrison?
I'll be very brief. Where I think hydrogen could eventually fill long haul, I think battery is forever going to be a short haul solution. It just faces much more strict physical limits in that respect. And you still have the question of what the mix of fuels providing the grid, giving you the electricity, of course. That having been said, I think that there is promise for a short haul market for battery electric.
Okay, thank you. Mark Morrison.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what everybody else has said, I think hydrogen, to my mind, is less likely for long-haul flights because of energy density issues, because the design of the aircraft would have to be quite dramatically different from how they are just now. I mean, I've seen some modelling for Airbuses. I mean, Airbus, I think, compared with Boeing, is exploring this much more. And it's a fixed wing. It's almost like a kite approach to it because of the dynamics of having to cryogenically store the hydrogen and how it's used up during the flight. But I do see an opportunity for short-haul flights in association with battery technology, particularly if we look at it in terms of fuel cell rather than just purely burning the hydrogen. And we're moving very much, if we look at HDVs, for example, heavy-duty vehicles across the UK, the most likely solution for refuelling them is going to be hydrogen, because battery tech at the moment is just not sufficiently energy dense enough for that. So there would be an infrastructure there for hydrogen. You can see that being on the islands. You can see that for short hop flights.
Okay, that's helpful. Mercedes, I'm going to bring you in, but just for time constraints, I had a wee kind of additional question, and you can answer the final one, or you can reflect on the first two that I've asked. That's up to yourself. But I got a wee note saying that there has been really good improvements for fuel efficiency over a number of years. Have we squeezed that as far as we can in terms of making more improvements in relation to that? So that doesn't have to be for you, Mercedes, that particular question. That's three questions that are kind of sitting there, if you like, now. But any reflection that any of the three, and if any of the other witnesses want to come back into a mop-up area of that, I'd be delighted to hear from them, Mercedes.
Yeah, I think we have done significant improvements in efficiency. Probably we still can do more, but that's not going to take us to the emissions reduction that we need. I would like to quantify a little bit around the flight length and the opportunities around battery, SAF and hydrogen, because we have published work on that, and I'll be happy to share the paper with this committee. And what we have identified is going from 2030 to 2050, what we call the distance for battery, hydrogen and SAF actually increases. So in 2030, what we see is the limit for electric flights will be around the 250 kilometers. Probably you may be able to fly up to 500 kilometers with hydrogen. Again, very small percentage of the market. Moving into 2050 and with technology development, what we see is electric could actually push boundaries to 500 kilometers, and hydrogen could take you a little bit more around the 3,000 kilometers. Long haul will always be dominated by SAF. But some of that may change a little bit, or some of that market may be taken by hydrogen, but that will be in the 2050 onwards. And just to quantify that, I thought that would be important.
That's very helpful. Do any other witnesses want to kind of, any final reflections on the questions that I've asked? Graham?
Yeah, I think Mercedes has got those figures perfectly right, and I totally agree. I think I just go back to the point that to make hydrogen out of electricity, you lose 50% of the energy. So you should just use batteries where you can use batteries, and SAF where you can use SAF. You'd have to think very carefully if you want to have a third fuel in that mix for aviation. Having batteries for short haul, I still think hydrogen will be always a problem in many people's minds, certainly in mine anyway. There's lots to be addressed in safety issues with that as a fuel at the present time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Now, Mark, I promised I'd bring you back in because you had a supplementary earlier that got lost in the chopping and changing as we did times. Mark, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks. I think what I've heard this morning is that it's the third generation, it's the e-fuels that will be dominating, and those will be the future going forward because of the, potential conflict with growing, biofeedstocks. But I'm just wondering about, a world maybe 10, 20 years down the line where, the whole of society is electrified, electric, battery, surface transport, hydrogen, electric heating. These are all going to create a huge amount of demand for generation. And I think I did see a figure in our briefing notes that suggested if we wanted to fully lean into e-fuels for aviation, we'd need 7 to 8 times more generating capacity in the UK for electricity than we had in 2020. So for me, it's not exactly the same as the biofuel side of things, where you're competing with food, and it's obviously limits the amount of land we have. But do you sort of acknowledge that there will be a point where, even with renewable electricity generation, we're kind of hitting the buffers because everything's going to be electrified, and our need for generation is going to double, treble, quadruple, quintuple potentially in the years ahead? Any thoughts on that?
Graham, don't lean back. Does anyone want to come in? Mark's got his hand up.
Personal reflection. I mean, yeah, I agree that we're moving towards a much more electrified society. I think ultimately there are going to be decisions that we as a society have to make. It's how much resource we have got available to us and how we best use that. And that might mean changes in attitudes as we go forward. As a country, I think we are in quite a unique position because we have got, I think, compared with the rest of the Europe, proportionally wise, we've got a lot more renewable energy potential. So we could be a net exporter. That doesn't help necessarily other people in the UK. Globally, I know that in the Middle East, there's lots of investment in solar projects, and part of those solar projects are to look at SAF and look at harnessing renewable energy to produce chemicals and other types of feedstocks. So I think it's a balance. It's a lot more than just looking at, will we have enough electricity to do SAF and to make these other things. It's a much wider societal issue that we face.
Okay, if no one else wants to come. Yep, Graham, you did lean forward.
I did, and I wanted to say something. Okay, I think if we're moving to total electrification of transportation, grain transportation in the UK and globally, then the refineries that currently produce kerosene, which is a byproduct of making gasoline and diesel, will no longer make it. And so we're going to need something that's an e-fuel or a kerosene, because it's a particular cut of the oil barrel at the present time, and it's about 5%. So if you don't have refineries making gasoline and diesel, you haven't got any jet, and so you probably end up having to import all of that, and therefore you have a security of energy problem for aviation. So there is a direction of travel here that we need to have a way of making SAF locally. So that's a point I would make. It's an unintended consequence of electrification, is that kerosene is not going to be available in the UK forever.
Okay, Mark, you happy with that?
I think Sebastian wanted to come in as well. Is that right?
Yeah. Sebastian, you're on.
Thank you. Very briefly, I just wanted to highlight that if I understand the question correctly, what it boils down to is we have a massive volume of energy currently being extracted from the ground and we need to find an alternative way of supplying what that energy supplies right now, essentially. I would turn that around a little bit as saying it increases the urgency. In the same way that runway expansion unlocks demand, increasing the urgency of SAF, SAF increases the urgency of identifying scalable renewable options for the grid, because yes, I think that there is all of these things imply a great deal of additional pressure on electrification and on the electrical grid. So yes, I agree.
Okay, just before we close off this session, one thing that struck me during this is that we're going to be really short of SAF, and we need to produce it at much bigger rates than we're doing at the moment. And I think somebody made the comment that it was some of the bigger airlines, I think it was you, Mercedes, that were using more SAF than anyone else. So if it's in short supply and the big users who have the buying power buy it all up, surely that's going to put pressure on the smaller airlines who won't be able to get their hands on it because the big producers or the big users are buying it all. So by increasing the pressure or demand for it, are we not going to force smaller users out? Do you want to say anything on that, Mercedes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point, that through smart construction of market interventions, you can try to moderate. But if you don't do anything, that's likely where the market may end up going. So that takes me back to something we have discussed before. So we talk about levies, we talk about all these different mechanisms. It's really how do you engineer them in practice to make sure that that doesn't happen. But the other point as well that we have been making this morning is this is one of opportunity. And if we are getting the mandate of what we need to have in terms of SAF, it's going to be an opportunity to produce it. And it has to be produced and it has to reach a number of users. So it's about market interventions that actually will get us what we want and will ensure domestic production.
I hear that, and I guess that the comment we heard from Graham that it might not be suitable for the smaller airlines on, say, island hopping trips, but if they were wanting to use it, they might not be able to get their hands on it if British Airways are buying it all, because they can buy it all and it might not be being produced locally. So I think there's an issue there as well, which we perhaps ought to consider. Thank you very much. I'm disappointed that all those days I spent as a child looking at the contrails flying across the sky was actually just looking at pollution, not the patterns they were making. I think it's been a very interesting session, and I'm slightly also concerned that it appears that we could distort this to the extent that it's cheaper to fly to Australia on a long-haul flight than it is cheaper than flying to Spain on a short-haul flight, which may affect a lot of people's holidays. So thank you very much. We are going to move into private session, but before I do that, I just want to put on record that in line with our standing orders, Monica Lennon, who's not here this morning, wouldn't be able to attend discussion item 6, but Sarah Boyack could join for that session, and the reason for that is it's Monica Lennon's bill. So that's on the record. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for the slight problems we had with broadcasting, but we'll now move into private session. Thank you.